Coming up, we're back. After a summer hiatus, we're climbing back on the horse with a great guest, Mark Gottfredson. Mark's a strategy consultant who's worked for global consulting leader Bain Company for almost 40 years. At the beginning of his career, Mark graduated from Harvard Business School with an MBA degree. In 2008, Mark published a book called The Breakthrough Imperative: How the Best Managers Get Outstanding Results. During his career, Mark has worked with some of the world's greatest CEOs and has led specialized performance improvement practices at Bain. In 2005, Consulting Magazine named Mark one of the world's top 25 consultants. So, yeah, he's good. Mark served in the Japan Tokyo mission from 1976 to 78 and returned in 2000 to be the mission president of the Japan Fukuoka mission. In this episode, we talk about the impact of strategic decisions like 2-Hour Church on actions like increased temples, the 3 key indicators of prospective missionary service, how Mark learned to lead as a collaborator, the mission experience as a microcosm of life, and a whole lot more. All this coming up next.
I don't know if that's true. I think the whole idea of retirement was a 20th century concept.
Yeah.
In the history of the world, retirement has not really been a part of the equation. So I don't know if it's healthy for us or not. But
Well, I guess that's true. If you're doing what you like to do now and you feel like you're making a difference, in my mind, retiring is like stepping away from other things so that you can do the things that you really want to do that are interesting to you, that you feel like you're making a difference rather than just punching the time card or whatever. But if you're already doing that, then I see your point.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So the first thing that I was wondering and wanted to ask you is, there's a lot of teenagers or people who grow up and they don't know, when you say consultant, they don't really know what that is. And so if you were to describe what you do, your profession, to a teenager, how would you describe that?
I think if I was talking to a teenager and they asked, what do you do? I would say, look, think about the products you use every day, the foods you eat every day. Somebody has to create those foods that go to grocery stores. They need to create the clothing that you wear. They need to create the products that you buy. Somebody makes those things. They make them in factories. Sometimes you buy services. You buy somebody come mow your lawn. They're running a business. What I do is help them run their business better. So if you've ever thought, I wish this company would just do this, it would meet my needs a lot better. I'm the guy who's behind the scenes trying to help them figure out how to make a better product for you that meets your needs better and at a cost that you can afford. That's what I'm doing, is helping companies really learn from each other and learn how they can make a better product for the consumer. And I give them advice on how to do that. And most of the time they implement it.
So they really outsource a lot of their hard problems to you, is what you're saying. And so I'm curious if you have any examples of some of the most interesting or some of the more challenging problems that you've worked on throughout your career.
Well, there's so many. I think one of the blessings of my career is that I've been able to work with many, many companies over the years and really make a difference with them. For example, early in my career, I had the opportunity to work for an auto company. It happened to be Chrysler, and they had just gone through basically a bankruptcy situation. And they were not making any money. They were actually bailed out by the U.S. government. The U.S. government gave them $5 billion to bail them out. But most people expected that they would just sort of run through that money and then they'd go out of business. And we were able to work with the CEO at the time was a guy named Lee Iacocca, and the president of the company was a guy named Hal Sperlich. And we worked for 5 years with that company, and we ended up paying the government back early. So I think that's one of the kinds of things that is a tremendous thing. More recently, I've worked with an automotive parts company. And this automotive parts company makes parts for mostly internal combustion engines. And we know that the world is starting to shift towards electric vehicles. What if you're in a business that makes all their parts for internal combustion engines, but the future is not in those parts?
Right. Problem.
How do you turn that company around? And how do you do it at a time when it's really uncertain how fast that transition is going to take place? So do you abandon everything now? Do you sell it at a discount? what can you do? And we helped that company build a portfolio of products that is really matched between internal combustion engine parts now. And they have made some acquisitions. They made some divestitures, and they're now in a position where they're kind of perfectly hedged. As their internal combustion engine vehicle business declines over time, the electric vehicle business will grow. And so they'll be able to survive through thick and thin. I've worked with consumer companies. I've worked with grocery stores to help them be better grocery stores and so on and so forth. So lots and lots of opportunities to help companies thrive and survive.
It sounds like pretty cool opportunities to meet a lot of really just cool people. Lee Iacocca, as you mentioned, everybody has heard of him for his marketing prowess, but to get to rub shoulders with those kind of people, I'm sure is a pretty neat experience.
Yeah, I think really one of the things that has been a big part of my career is being able to work with chief executives of companies, many of whom are well-known, some who aren't well-known, but being able to see people that are really effective leaders and things like that, that's been a blessing in my life.
I picked up your book, your Breakthrough Imperative book, because I was going to do a bit of research on you. I started reading it, but as you went through your writing process and your research and study process for that, was there anything that you learned that you didn't necessarily know going into the writing of that book?
I think some of the general principles, one of the points of the book was to try and put together some of the fundamental laws, if you will, around what makes business successful and what do you have to try and manage over time. And so those kind of basic fundamental laws, they don't change. And I think from the beginning, we had a real opportunity to kind of build on our hypothesis. One of the things I thought was really interesting is the second principle is that your competitive position determines your options. And the first one was that costs and prices always decline. And so you have to take advantage of that, right? If you're the largest, you should be able to come down the cost curve faster than everybody else. We call it the experience curve. But what I didn't know when we started was just how powerful that was quantitatively. So we did some research and we looked at every single publicly traded company in the world. And then we put them into groups of businesses that were defined. So we're looking at the right competitive set for each company. And then we looked at how their results performed over time. And so it turns out that if you are the largest company in your industry, what we would expect is that you would have higher profitability. And if you are a small company in your industry, you would have less. It's not always true, but how true is it? Well, it turns out that if you are the largest in your industry and you're 50% larger than your closest competitor, over a 5-year period, looking at all publicly traded companies and looking at all the largest in their industries, 80% of them will exceed their cost of capital over 5 years. In other words, they will be more profitable than the market is demanding over 5 years. If you go the other side and you are less than half the size of the big guy in your industry, the odds that you will exceed your cost of capital over 5 years is about 20%. So 80% of them don't make the returns that their investors are expecting. And that's a really powerful correlation. Obviously, 20% of small guys do better than expected, and 20% of big guys do worse than expected. Now, that's a big opportunity for consultants to come in and help those guys that aren't doing as well improve and get their entitlement. But it also says if you're hunting for a job and you want a career with a company that's going to be successful, if you can get a job with the leader, it's more likely to grow, more likely to thrive. You're more likely to have success at what you're doing if you join that kind of a company. Mm-hmm. Of course, this is something that it also turns out that people kind of understand this, and followers in the industry have more difficulty hiring good people than the large guys do. And all that plays into those things. But the tightness of the correlation that if you're larger on a relative basis, you do better was a remarkable finding, I think.
That is such an interesting thing, given that you take into account the theory of creative destruction, where large industries and large companies are also susceptible to complete destruction at times. And so it's an interesting kind of balance.
Well, it is. And like I said, there's always that 20% of the large companies that are not doing well and are possibly being disrupted and everything else. And that's where we get into the other points, which is that the customers and profit pools don't stand still. So if you ever stagnate, you'll lose that benefit. But if you're the largest and you are constantly trying to improve, then you should be able to avoid being disrupted.
The church has their own internal strategy consulting department that works with the Quorum of the 12 in that team. How have you seen the impact of strategy and consulting play out in the church as an institution? I don't know this for sure, but I kind of assumed that like changes like 2-hour church and smaller temples and stuff were at least first vetted through strategy consultants before going all the way through the brethren.
Well, I have had some influence on the church developing a strategy department. I have done a little bit of work with the church on that. But if you think about it, there's some very interesting things. For example, the church made some decisions a few years ago as it relates to buildings. Essentially, the church had a strategy of having pretty standard building designs throughout the world and believed that you could get economies of scale in purchasing and everything else if you got the materials, and then you could even send them around the world, or you could have your suppliers make them in different countries and things like that. And the standards for the buildings were quite common across the world. So just to give you an example, in Brazil, there was a steak center, beautiful steak center, but kind of built in a neighborhood of favelas and an area with a lot of crime. And so the outside of the steak center, there's a wall all the way around it. And there is concrete on top with broken glass at the top of the concrete so people don't climb over it and ruin the building. And the church thought, this is great. We've got the nicest building in the neighborhood. Everybody should be attracted to the church. In fact, the impact was the opposite. The impact was that people called the church, oh, this is the more money church.
Interesting.
This is not Mormon church, it's the more money church. And parents wouldn't send their kids to Mutual because they were afraid that if somebody saw their child entering the building, that they'd be at risk of being kidnapped because of the money. And so the church realized that actually you think you're saving money, but you're not. And in fact, it's very, very expensive to build to U.S. standards in a place like Brazil or the Democratic Republic of Congo, and that you could actually save a lot of money. You would actually have more satisfied members, and people would feel better about everything if the buildings were built to the standards of the community in which they live.
Yeah, interesting.
Well, that actually turns out that it saves a tremendous amount of money, which can then be applied to building temples. And makes money available for the building of temples. And similarly, the switch to 2-hour. Well, I think there's a lot of reasons for switch to 2-hour, which includes home-centered and church-supported. It's a really nice synergy there between that concept and cost. Instead of having 4 wards in a building, you could now have 5 wards in a building. 5 wards in a building. I mean, if you look at the number of buildings that the church has to build in North America as a result of that, it's a huge drop. And there's a very strong correlation between that and the number of temples being announced.
That's really fascinating.
So these are actions that the church can take, which move the work forward by thinking strategically and thoughtfully, analytically about the cost structure and thinking about what works best for the members and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I've never even thought about that cascading effect of we see all the boom in the temples that are announced and we think, wow, this is really crazy. But to dig a little deeper into it and go, there's a lot behind this, things like cost reductions and things that are maybe influencing the ability to make those kinds of decisions. It's a really fascinating concept when you dig a little bit deeper than the surface of it. So if somebody were to go to the church internal strategy department and say, young people today are leaving the church, what should the church do about it? Your consultant brain, like at a high level, where would you go to solve that problem or at least begin tackling it?
It's really interesting. My brain can't help but think that way. And so I've thought strategically when I was serving as a bishop. I've thought strategically when I was serving as a stake president. And in fact, as a stake president, we dealt with this issue. We had about 30% of our young men going out on missions. Now, it actually turns out that's pretty close to the average for the church, but I found that just ridiculous. We had sacrament meeting attendance of over 50% in the stake. Why don't we have at least 50% of our youth going on missions? And it also turns out that the church has done studies that if a young man goes on a mission 10 years later, the likelihood of him being active is dramatically higher than if they don't go on missions, because missions really do make a difference in terms of people's lives and how they view the church and their ability to build a testimony. And so as a stake president, I started thinking about this. And as I was interviewing missionaries for missions, I discovered that every missionary that went on a mission had one or more of 3 attributes. The first attribute was, some had 1, some had 2, some had 3. But the first attribute that seemed to come up is that a lot of people came from families where It was kind of an expectation from the time they were young that they would end up going on a mission, and they're close to their family. Their families prayed together every day. They read the scriptures together every day. They held family home evening on Mondays. They were families where there was daily religious observance and there was an expectation that the young person would serve a mission. And so I would be interviewing and they'd say, from the time I can remember, I've always wanted to go on a mission. It's been an expectation in my family.
Mhm.
And my family's done all these things, and consequently, I continue to want to serve. Second attribute that I often saw is that individuals had had a unique spiritual experience that had basically told them that the church was true. I would ask them, tell me about your testimony. Tell me about how it has developed, and have there ever been any major milestones in your life that you can mention that this is the time when I really felt like the church was true, or I came to that knowledge that the church was true. And these individuals had had that kind of experience, which allowed them to be able to stand on their own 2 feet when there was peer pressure and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
Like I said, a lot of these people that came from homes that had that daily religious observance also had that attribute. But there were individuals who came from homes with less active parents that had had those kinds of spiritual experiences. And it was remarkable to me how often when they would sort of describe what those major milestones, how often it occurred at an EFY, or now it would be FSY,
Mhm.
or on a trek or a girls' camp or something like that helped them to build that testimony. And then the third one is actually kind of surprising, but it may have actually been the strongest one. And it was, all my buddies are going on a mission, and so I'm going too.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting, I think, because you've probably experienced this. You see a priest quorum, 5 priests in the quorum, and they're all best friends, and they do things together on the weekend, and they kind of strengthen each other, and all 5 of them end up going on missions. I had 3 sons, and for some of them, that was actually the case. They were in that kind of a quorum. But then you run in 2 years later, same ward,
Right.
same priest quorum, 5 priests, but they're not all best friends.
Right.
And they don't do things together, and only 1 or 2 of them ends up going on a mission. And you see that pattern. It's the same bishop, it's the same priest quorum advisor, everything else.
Right. It's almost it's a controlled, yeah.
It is. It is this controlled environment. And so the value of those peer relationships is really great. And so as a stake presidency, we started focusing on all 3 of those. How can we get
Interesting.
more daily religious observance in homes? How can we create situations where, like the EFY, like the Trek experience, how can we create more of those experiences where the youth will actually gain a testimony? And then how can we create an environment where there's more peer relationships? And I'm not going to go into all the detail of what we did. I'll just mention on the peer relationships, what we ultimately did was we ended up having wards rotate activities together once a month. So Ward A would have mutual with Ward B in January, and then Ward A with Ward C in February. And so then deacons would get to know all the deacons in the state.
Mhm.
And we started to have lots of cross-ward friendships blossoming. Because let's face it, you've got a 14 and 15-year-old young women's class that has 3 young women in it. What's the chance that they end up being best friends?
Right.
They might be. But if those young women can get with the young women of 8 other wards, now they have a pool of 30 or more young women that they could be friends with. Now you've got something that really creates those peer relationships. And over the time that I served as stake president, we moved from about 30% of our young men to about 67%
Wow.
of our young men, and a very high percentage of our young women serving missions.
Wow. That's amazing. So for you, when you decided to serve, was it all 3, or was there one that was stronger than the other that kind of compelled you to want to serve a mission?
I'd say I had the first 2. I was born of goodly parents, and we did have religious observance in our home, and we read the scriptures together, and we held family home evening. I did not have strong peer sets. I went to high school in a small school in southeastern Colorado, and was the only only member my age. So I didn't have the benefit of that peer set, but I did have the first 2. And I'd had some strong spiritual experiences that really helped me be centered and go on my mission.
So you got your call to Japan. Could you tell us a little bit about what your experience was like first arriving to Japan, having to learn a language from the beginning?
I was excited when I got called to Japan. I knew that Japan was in the Orient, but I actually didn't know exactly where it was on the globe.
Yeah. Far away.
I mean, it was just a faraway place. But I was excited for the opportunity to learn a language. Now, I'll just tell you, it was difficult though. And in my day, we had a lesson plan, and what we spent 2 months in the MTC doing was memorizing that lesson plan. And we would sit around in rooms with kind of our eyes closed, trying to remember the paragraphs that we just looked at, and we had no idea what we were saying. No idea whatsoever what we were saying. We were just memorizing sounds, if you will. I mean, obviously, on the opposite side of the page, you knew the topic, but you didn't know which one was I and which one was church.
Right. Right. Yeah. You're mimicking, you're parroting.
That's right. I mean, Japanese grammar is exactly the opposite of English grammar, So the things that are at the end of the sentence or at the beginning of the sentence in Japanese and so on. And so went through that process. And then we got to Japan, and actually it's just such an experience to me of how the Lord actually works and strengthens his missionaries. I had been in Japan for, I don't know, something like that, maybe 2 weeks. And my companion and I were knocking on doors. And a fairly young housewife answered the door. And so it was my turn to do the door. And so I gave my memorized door approach. We are missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we have a family-oriented message we'd love to share with you. Mm-hmm. Could we meet with you and your family? And of course, she expressed that her husband wasn't home. We couldn't teach sisters alone in their homes. So my companion, I couldn't understand anything she was saying. So my companion picked up the conversation and asked if we could come back that evening. And she said yes. And she used a word which I was able to recognize that she had said the word. Didn't recognize the word was nombiri. And my companion didn't know the word either. And so we looked up in our dictionaries as we were walking away from the home and said, I'm easygoing. Basically what she said is, I'm easygoing. Sure. Come on back. Mm-hmm. And so we went back that night, and her husband was there. He was smoking, and he saw it as just a great opportunity to be very, very argumentative. And so I gave my little sections of the lesson plan, my memorized words, which I'm sure I was
slaughtering it,
destroying it. And my companion was having a conversation, and this guy wanted to argue with my companion, and a big argument sort of was ensuing. And I could see that it wasn't going well, and it was getting contentious. And so I thought, at least I can't understand anything that's going on, but I can at least bear my testimony. So I bore my testimony in very simple Japanese, that I knew the church was true and that Jesus was the Christ. And that's all I could say. That's all I could say. And that ended up being kind of the end of the meeting. And surprisingly, the guy agreed to have us back. The next week we had splits. And so I didn't go back to the family. My companion went with another companion and went to the meeting, and we got back together after we'd spent time that night. And my companion and the exchange missionary that he went out with said that they'd had this great meeting at the Suzuki's house. And apparently what happened is they went in and they sat down, and Brother Suzuki said, how long is that guy who was here last time? How long has he been in Japan? And my companion said, like 2 weeks. And he said, well, I've been thinking about it. If somebody can be out 2 weeks and speak like he spoke in Japanese, God has to have his hand in it. And so they started taking the discussions, and they didn't get baptized while I was in the area, but they did about a year later. I mean, he had word wisdom problems he had to work on and things like that, but they did end up joining the church. They've been very strong, and today he's a counselor in the Tokyo Temple Presidency.
Wow.
So, at 2 weeks, the Lord did something there.
Yeah. So did you find that many people were kind of confrontational, or were a lot of them easygoing? Was there any kind of lingering resentment at all towards the U.S. from World War II fallout, or was it pretty good terms?
I'd say for the most part, they were quite accepting. It was, for most of them, even then, to meet an American or to meet a Caucasian was, kind of a unique experience for them. And Their country was starting to really blossom at that point, and the U.S. had been kind to them after the war in terms of helping them develop. And I think the vast majority of people didn't resent, even though many of them had lost family members, grandparents and things like that who had served in the war. But general, they were pretty accepting. I would say most people were just not interested. If you were street contacting or something like that, they'd wave their hand like this, which means, no, I'm not interested.
Right.
I don't want to talk to you.
Yeah. Interesting. This is a small aside. Have you seen the new Godzilla movie, Godzilla -1?
No, I haven't.
It's a Japanese created movie. It's great. Can't vouch for it enough. I tell people it felt like watching a period piece on post-war Japan, not a movie about Godzilla. Godzilla was like a minor character in the film. It was great. All in Japanese, so you could
Right.
understand it firsthand.
Oh, I need to watch it.
Yeah, I think it's on
Okay.
Netflix, so yeah, check that one out. But was there anything else that you experienced that stood out to you in your mission that's had a lasting effect on who you are and the way you go about your life?
I mean, one of the things about a mission is it's a microcosm of life. You come there as a baby and you leave as
Yes.
an adult. And I think that there is a learning pattern there that provides a level of wisdom that you can't find any other way but a mission. I think a lot of what I've learned in terms of how to work with people, how to get things done, came from my time in the mission field. I had the blessing of serving as an assistant, and our mission president was a fabulous mission president, but he really had my companion and I kind of act like co-chief operating officers of the mission. We ran the proselyting side of the mission, and he ran the dealing with the emotional issues of the missionaries and things like that, but we kind of ran the operations. And my companion at the time said, it'll be 20 years before we have this level of responsibility in the corporate world if that ever happens.
Yeah.
And he was right. He was absolutely right.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating thing to be thrust in at that young of an age and get those kinds of responsibilities. Like you're saying, I think the same, to this point in my career, I haven't had the chance to lead or guide in the same way that I did as I did 10 years ago. It's an incredible experience for a kid just fresh out of high school to dip their toes into, well, they're not dipping their toes in, they're diving headfirst into that world, but it's such a great experience. And the other point you mentioned, the microcosm of life, is one that I've thought about a lot. I don't know if they did this in your mission, but in ours, we talk about who your dad was your trainer, and if somebody was finishing their mission, they were dying, and there was all those kinds of parallels with life. But it's very, very true. And there's just a lot of similarities where it's life put into 2 years, and you kind of you get a little snapshot of what your life is like.
Yep, certainly do.
You mentioned once in a talk you gave, you said, quote, everybody ends up being leaders in their lives, and that leadership's often more subtle than we tend to think. And you shared some principles of leadership. How did your mission help you to develop those ideals of leadership, of what a good leader is?
So obviously I learned a lot as a young missionary. I may have learned even more as a mission leader or as a mission president. So let me just share a little bit of something that I learned when I was serving as a mission president. I came into the mission, I served in the Japan Fukuoka mission, and the mission was a great mission, and there were great missionaries, but the baptisms were averaging about 11 per month in a mission with 165 missionaries. It just weren't a lot of baptisms. And I felt like that's just crazy. We can do much, much better than this. And so with my corporate training and having watched a lot of chief executives and being a consultant, PowerPoint slides, statistics, and all of those kinds of things, I decided that I wanted to bring those leadership skills into the mission and really motivate the missionaries to improve on the statistics and look at the root causes. How many people do you have to talk to a day? You name it, all those kinds of things. And let's set goals. Let's see where we can get to. And I set some very aggressive goals for the mission and everything else. And to be honest with you, I had a measure of success with that. My enthusiasm, encouragement did get the missionaries out there. They started working harder. And we saw the statistics go up. And I got there in July, and in August, we had a banner month of baptisms. And in September, we had a huge number of baptisms. And in October, it completely collapsed. Everybody had they sort of went on a sprint on the basis of the new mission president coming in, and they had some pretty good results. They absolutely couldn't sustain it, nor was it worth it to them to do this for the mission president. to achieve the mission president's goals.
Right.
So October was terrible. November was terrible. December was worse. And I continued to put my slides up. And then I got a little bit vocal with the missionaries. You're slacking off. You're sort of reprimanding them, calling them to repentance, and so on and so forth. We got into January, and I met with the zone leaders, my mission leadership council. And I said, elders, at that time we didn't have sister training leaders, but I said, elders, I'm pretty discouraged. I don't know what's going on, but our numbers have gone down. Seems like we have all the tools, but I don't know what to do. I'm just going to sit back. You tell me what you think we ought to do as a mission. And then I let the missionaries talk. What should we be doing? What should we get to? And I let them develop the set of goals that they wanted to go after. I let them develop the ways that we were going to do it, the things that they thought worked out in the field, and so on and so forth. And then I said, okay, now go teach your zones. And February ended up being better, and March ended up being better, and just about every month was better for the rest of our mission because of that thing I learned about leadership, which is that you can tell people all you want. You can maybe inspire them for a short time, but unless it's coming from their hearts, they're not going to move for very long. Mm-hmm. And that was a huge lesson for me, even after I'd been on a career and had worked with CEOs for many, many years.
So did you carry that over into your career post-mission presidency?
I think so. I think I was, as a consultant, and in terms of my success, it was even greater after coming back. And I certainly think I've given that advice to so many CEOs. You think you have a vision, but until it's their vision, you really don't have a vision, is some advice that I've given over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned being a mission president. You have also been a stake president. You've seen a lot of missionaries leave. You've seen a lot of missionaries come home. What are some of the key changes you've seen in them? How are they different from when they left?
Well, just as we talked earlier about a mission being a microcosm of life, they come back much wiser, much, much wiser than they were when they left. They've experienced a lot of things. They've had to work with people. Unfortunately, in today's world, they've faced rejection more than any human being should face rejection. I've had to learn how to deal with those things. And that does build maturity. Those trials in life do help us grow. It's like in 2 Nephi chapter 2, verse 23, where it says that if Adam and Eve remained in the garden, they would have had no joy, for they knew no misery. And missionaries definitely experience rejection and things like that, and it helps them understand what the real keys to joy are. The tragedy that I see in missionaries sometimes is they don't really know how to make that transition. They don't know which things to change and which things not to change. So you come back, you're going to start dating members of the opposite sex, start being alone with a person of the opposite sex, which you can never do on your mission. That's a completely new experience for most people after they get back. You don't have to get up at 6:30 in the morning. And by the way, you don't have to read your scriptures every day, and you don't have to say your prayers. And I think that one of the reasons we see some fall away is that they stop doing those fundamental basic habits, those daily religious observances I talked about earlier. And one of the things I can say as a stake president is I've interviewed, as a stake president, as a mission president, as an Area 70, as a bishop, I've done thousands and thousands and thousands of interviews with people. And I can honestly say that when I'm talking to people and they're struggling with their testimony, I'll ask them, tell me about your prayers. Are you praying daily? Are you reading your scriptures daily? Are you holding family home evening? Are you praying with your spouse? I have never met anybody who is doing those daily religious observances who's actually having a faith crisis. And I've never met anybody in a faith crisis who can actually tell me that they're doing all those things. So it's kind of simple. It's kind of simple, really. If a missionary comes home and they're able to keep those daily observances in their lives, it will help them be successful from a spiritual standpoint for the rest of their life.
Last question. How would you say that your mission, including your mission as a young person and then your mission presidency, how has that helped you be a better human being?
I've learned to listen to the Spirit through those opportunities. And that guides me in pretty much all my interactions. Any meeting that I go into, I'm constantly asking for the guidance of the Spirit, whether it's a business meeting or a church meeting or whatever it is. And of course, I'm still not perfect at that, but I have learned to listen to the Spirit, and that makes all the difference.
That's great. Well, you're a busy guy, Mark. Thank you for your time. It's been a real pleasure to visit with you.
Good to visit with you too. I think you're doing a good thing, and hopefully the listenership will grow and grow.
Yeah, we'll see. Hopefully. All right. Thanks again, Mark.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Okay, have a
We'll
good
talk
day.
to you later.
Yep, bye-bye. Those 3 points of one, if there's an expectation, but that's, I think he's referring to a family expectation or just a larger cultural expectation to serve. Number 2, having had a unique spiritual experience. And he mentioned a few of the things that are common to promoting those kinds of experiences like EFY or FSY, whatever it is now, and different young men's, young women's activities, which makes sense why we put so much emphasis on those for young people, is making sure we do those activities. And the other one that is a big deal now that you hear a lot of people talk about, a lot of youth talk about, but it's it used to be HEFI, but I forget what it's called, but it's the humanitarian summer trips for youth.
HFSY or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know what they call it now.
Some whatever.
But those are cool.
Yeah,
Those are great
I see
experiences
some of
for
that.
people. I think they can have spiritual experiences, but it's at least giving them a really strong, different experience that they can go, oh, this is something, I like this. I like the feeling of helping, of serving people, even if they don't have the spiritual experience. Anyway, the third point was the network effects of having friends, which is definitely true. I mean, I saw that with a lot of my friends who maybe didn't have as much of the first two, but had the third, had friends and said, oh, okay, if they're going, then I'm going to go because what am I going to do? Be left home alone? And those are great. I think those are really great key indicators of whether a young person's going to be able to make the decision to go out on a mission. Anyway, I like those ones. And then the microcosm of life, which we touched on quite a few times, but you remember this, Jake. Like, I've thought about that aspect of it a lot, where you really are born, you don't know anything, you don't know anybody. You have people who, in this case, a person who takes care of you, your trainer who does pretty much everything for you. I did nothing during my training. I didn't contact. I just followed him around, and you just learn everything just like a kid in life. And then it's just that accelerated development where you get to see yourself developing, which in the real world, you're talking decades. In the mission timeline, you're talking transfers, weeks. But it does it. It's so cool how it mirrors your maturation and evolution throughout life to the point of getting to the point of dying, of finishing your mission. And you're sad for the people that you're going to be leaving in the mission and your friends and that, but you're also excited because you get to go see the people back at home, your family and your old friends. And I imagine it's going to be very similar to how we feel when we get closer to death and we start actually thinking about that stuff and thinking about seeing our parents and our grandparents and some of our loved people who have passed away. And it's really a cool part of the mission that it so closely mirrors the general trajectory of a lifetime.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that was probably one of my favorite parts that you guys brought up.
I wanted to talk, I didn't know if I would talk about that with him or somebody else, but I've been wanting to talk about that in relation to the mission with somebody, because I have thought about that a lot lately, of how that's such a cool aspect. For whatever reason, the structure of a mission is set up really in a way that can uniquely parallel the life experience.
Yeah, and I think we all kind of took different meanings out of that. Like, some of us spend our whole mission thinking about the end.
Yeah.
Like, this is going to end, and you have a sense of urgency. You have an urgency to get your work done, to grow as a person, to develop relationships with people in your mission that you know that you're leaving behind. And for me, that was a big part of it. It was knowing that it was coming to an end and that I had a limited amount of time. And no matter how I felt today, or the fact that the monsoon was pouring down on us, there was still an incentive to try to get something going, to get a few extra contacts, maybe a more meaningful lesson with this less active member, because we thought maybe I'm going to be transferring to a new area next week, and this is my last chance to make an impact on someone.
That's a really good point.
I don't know. That's how
That's a really good point, because being time bound like that, to say, I know that in 730 days or whatever, this will be over and I'm going home and this will end. You valued it. I valued it. I savored it, at the times where I wasn't like hating it, which those happen too. But you try to make the most, like you're saying, of each day and of each moment and experience. It's easy to get lost in life where you don't think about the end, and maybe that's a good thing, but as a result, you end up not valuing the present and not savoring every day that you have and getting the most out of it and valuing it. So good message from the mission, a good lesson. Okay, that's it for the pod. Thanks again to Mark for sharing his time with us, and thanks to Jake for hopping on after to chat. I'll keep bringing you interviews with high-performing folks from a range of specialties, so keep tuning in. And if you like what you hear, tell a friend. See you next time.